Welcome to the Kevin Bass Show long-form podcast. If you have an idea that you take from this podcast that you want to apply to your own life, you should always talk to your doctor before doing so and never construe anything you hear as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the Kevin Bass Show. Hey everybody, this is Kevin Bass. I want to talk about the role of anecdote and of meta-analysis and systematic review, the two different poles of the evidence hierarchy in science. So it's often thought that systematic reviews and meta-analyses are at the very pinnacle, the zenith, the apex of the evidence pyramid, or the evidence hierarchy, as it is often called. This conceptualization is something that many people are introduced to in, say, the first day, or at least the first few classes of any research methodology, or even often any class that looks at the research within many different kinds of fields within the health sciences, all the way from psychology to neuroscience to medicine to fitness and nutrition. All of these fields all start with the same evidence hierarchy, the same pyramid, with systematic reviews and meta-analyses at the very top. And then at the very bottom, things like expert opinion, things like anecdote, things like case studies, all at the very bottom. Well, that's a dramatic oversimplification, and we can see that by taking two examples. The first example is a meta-analysis and systematic review published either at the end of last year or at the beginning of this year, I believe it was the end of last year, on Ivermectin, showing by pulling together many different small randomized controlled trials showing that Ivermectin was effective for the treatment of COVID-19. This produced a huge controversy because this meta-analysis seemed very legit. It came out of, I believe, Newcastle, and from some very accomplished meta-analysts, and was considered a legitimate meta-analysis on the topic. The problem, as it was discovered, was that many of the randomized controlled trials included in the meta-analysis were fraudulent, undermining the validity of the meta-analysis. The randomized controlled trials in the meta-analysis had fabricated data. They showed that Ivermectin worked for COVID-19, but only because those data were bad data. And so the meta-analysis came to faulty conclusions. If we take from this situation, this example, if we take from this example that Ivermectin definitely works because it's a systematic review and meta-analysis that we're looking at, then we come to faulty conclusions about Ivermectin and its efficacy for COVID-19. So we can't blindly apply this evidence hierarchy. You can't blindly say, well, this is all the best evidence we have. Because it's the best evidence we have to accept the conclusions. We can't do that. That's actually the wrong thing to do in the case of Ivermectin. It's actually scientifically wrong. Similarly, there was a man, and I forget what his name was. We can look him up. His name was Barry Marshall. He was sure that the cause of gastric ulcers, gastritis, peptic ulcer disease, was microbial, a bacterium. The current thinking of the day was that gastric ulcers are caused by stress. What he showed after a series of mouse experiments was that by growing H. pylori in culture, in culture medium, in the laboratory, pure H. pylori, and then ingesting it, he could reproduce gastric ulcers in himself. He could create the gastric ulcers, and then by treating with antibiotics, he could treat the gastric ulcers, showing that H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori bacterium, was responsible for gastritis and peptic ulcer disease. Okay? In that case, it was a N of 1 trial. It was just one person trying one thing and demonstrating in a rigorous manner, right? I take this H. pylori, I drink it, I get gastric ulcers, I get rid of the H. pylori, I get rid of the gastric ulcers. I do the same thing in animals. Therefore, H. pylori is a cause of gastritis and peptic ulcer disease. And he won the Nobel Prize in 2005 for these experiments. In his case, his N of 1 trial, his anecdote, which he very rigorously controlled and reported, his anecdote was scientific and truthful, and it indicated something important. So here we see at two poles of the evidence hierarchy. One in the case of ivermectin, we have a systematic review and meta-analysis that basically spits out a trash conclusion because the data are trash. And then you have, on the other hand, an anecdote, an N of 1 trial that's very carefully conducted, winning ultimately the Nobel Prize. We can see that this so-called evidence hierarchy, this evidence pyramid, doesn't apply in all cases. So what is it? The evidence pyramid, the evidence hierarchy is a guideline for the interpretation of evidence, and it cannot be used in a cookie cutter or cookbook manner. You can't simply apply it, not knowing anything about the science or the subject matter, and then come out with conclusions, and then anybody who doesn't apply it is being biased or unscientific. It's not how it works. Science is a discussion where you have to take each piece of evidence on a case-by-case basis, and each piece of evidence has its own strengths and weaknesses in any given field, and it doesn't matter what the study design is, although the study design does affect what those strengths and weaknesses are. It's not the study design itself, say being a randomized controlled trial or being a meta-analysis, doesn't determine the quality of the evidence by itself. Okay? In an ideal world where every meta-analysis and systematic review is of the utmost pristine quality and every study contained therein is of the utmost and best quality, we would be able to say, yeah, that's a gold standard piece of evidence. But in the real world, that's not often the case. Often that's not the case. And in those circumstances, you have to evaluate what the actual evidence actually say, and it's not cherry picking or anything else to do so. Now, people on the internet who don't have scientific training, who want to be experts about whatever they're reading about, they're learning about a specific field, and then they learn that, say, a systematic review and meta-analysis says X, Y, and Z, and they want to just be able to accept that. People need to understand that it's not, you can't do that. To ultimately know whether or not to accept a finding in the field, you have to ultimately have expertise in that topic. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be the world's leading scientists on it, but you do have to understand those studies contained in that body of literature. And if you don't understand those studies, you aren't going to get anywhere. You're going to misunderstand and misrepresent the evidence. You're going to put it together in an inconsistent manner, and you are going to come to false conclusions. Likewise, you're going to dismiss all anecdotes as just anecdotes. Now, if we do have really rigorous studies, especially from multiple different angles and multiple different perspectives, showing that whatever that person is saying in that anecdote is saying the wrong thing, then yeah, of course, like, yeah, you got to go with the studies and not what the person is saying, especially if you can explain the anecdote, in very obvious and plausible ways, given the body of knowledge that we have, and show that the causal inferences made are not true. For example, and this is just an example, I don't say this is necessarily 100% true, but like, let's just say an example. for seed oils, many people like exclude seed oils from the diet, and then they see that their inflammation is much lower. They don't have as much back pain. They don't have as much joint pain. They feel better. Well, the interesting thing about seed oils is seed oils are often in packaged processed foods, ultra palatable, ultra processed foods, hyper palatable, ultra processed foods. And so when you're excluding seed oils, you're excluding these foods. So now, are you getting those benefits from excluding the seed oils or from excluding those foods? Right? You don't know that if you're changing both of those at the same time, which you are changing if you're eating a bunch of ultra processed foods that have seed oils in them, and then you're excluding those foods in order to exclude the seed oils. You're changing multiple different things at the same time, not just multiple different things. Like, there's many different things in those foods. There's like 20 different things. And it gets more complicated too, because are you also replacing those foods, the calories from those foods, with other foods that are more wholesome, right? Or are you increasing the amount of other foods that you're eating, that you're already eating, that are more wholesome? And so is the benefit to your joints and all that stuff coming from the reduction in seed oils, the reduction in ultra-processed foods, or the addition of more healthy foods? We don't know. It gets more complicated because changing the amount of ultra-processed foods actually can sometimes change the amount of calorie consumption you have. So you're reducing seed oils, you're reducing ultra-processed foods, you're replacing with different foods that are more satiating and less hyperpalatable. Your calorie consumption is going down. Calorie consumption is inherently it inherently modulates immunity and inflammation. So if you reduce your calorie intake, your joints will tend to get better. They'll tend to feel better. You'll tend to be less inflamed. You'll have fewer inflammatory markers on blood tests. And that's been very clearly shown in multiple different studies. So is it the ultra-processed foods you're reducing? Is it the seed oils? Is it the different ingredients in the ultra-processed foods? Is it the new foods that you're replacing them with? Is it some particular component of those new foods that you're replacing with? Is it the change in calorie intake that you're experiencing? Or potentially, is it the new gym membership that you just started that's also helping you? So often with diet anecdotes, and many different kinds of anecdotes, not just diet anecdotes, but many lifestyle anecdotes, they're horribly confounded. And so you can't really draw conclusions from them because it's not really well controlled. Now compare this to the H. pylori anecdote, where you just introduce a microbe, you get rid of it, and ideally, to be technically and scientifically honest here, you probably need more than just one person doing that experiment. You need to do it over and over again. You can do it in one person. You can give them H. pylori, you can get gastric ulcers, you can treat them, you can give them H. pylori again, gastric ulcer, and treat them, and then do it several different times, and that's called an ABAB, formatted N of 1 trial. But ideally, you have to do multiple different times to show causality, because there always could be some other confounding factor during that first time that you conduct that experiment. So like, let's say you take the H. pylori, but then your stress level goes up at the same time. So you're not actually disproving that stress causes gastric ulcers. You're not proving that H. pylori does. It's just some good, interesting evidence that suggests that H. pylori does. But if you have to do that trial multiple times, multiple different people, to average out that potential confounder of stress. And this whole averaging out effect is what we use randomization for. We also use crossover studies for. But you have to be able to causally infer that it's definitely not the stress, and it's definitely the H. pylori that's causing gastric ulcers. And you do that through several different other methods to ensure that that causal inference is legitimate and valid. But that kind of N of 1 trial, that kind of anecdote is much more powerful than, say, a diet anecdote. Right? So there's some kinds of anecdotes that are legitimate and that are reasonable, and some kind of anecdotes that are not. Okay? And you have to understand the details of the field with respect to these anecdotes, and also how to think about anecdotes in the first place in order to flesh and to take apart what is a legitimate use of an anecdote and what's not. And then the same goes with the systematic review and meta-analysis, which ultimately means you have to have expertise. Now, a lot of the evidence-based, quote-unquote, evidence-based frameworks downplay expertise in the evaluation of evidence, but I've just shown you that expertise is a critical factor. Now, by itself, it's not a critical factor, right? I can't just say, oh, I'm an expert, therefore listen to me, I have expertise, therefore I know how to interpret these properly. You have to actually evaluate the evidence yourself, but here's the conundrum, and it's a beautiful conundrum, and it's the conundrum and a paradox at the heart of these evidence-based models. In order to know whether that person is who is an expert and is claiming expertise is right or not, how do I do that? I have to evaluate their claims on a case-by-case basis in exactly the same way I've just shown that you need to evaluate different claims in a very nuanced, detail-oriented manner without a blind adherence to some sort of evidence hierarchy, but actually just evaluating the details of each and every individual study. And in doing so, I have to be an expert myself. And here's where it gets really interesting. Let's say some guy says they're an expert, and I say, well, I don't know if you're an expert, so I'm going to evaluate myself. I'm going to make sure, as an expert, I'm evaluating you as an expert. And then I go, okay, I'm satisfied. And then I raise my hand and I say, hey, look, everybody, I'm an expert. I determined that he's an expert. Do you guys see the problem here? Because how do you know that what I'm saying is true without evaluating the evidence yourself? You can't. Ultimately, in the end, because you could have an infinite regression of experts, you say, okay, well, therefore, I'm an expert, he's an expert. But in order to know that we're both experts, you also have to evaluate the evidence. And then in order to know that you are an expert, everybody else has to evaluate. In order for there not to be an infinite regression of different experts who are then becoming experts in order to evaluate whether X, Y, and Z person is an expert, ultimately, it has to boil down to trust. You have to ultimately be able to trust the person that you're talking to, and they have to somehow earn legitimacy, be considered legitimate by you as a legitimate expert and telling you the truth. And there's no way around this problem. These evidence-based approaches, they're good for experts. Experts are good to use them, to understand them, and to evaluate evidence scientifically, at least as an introduction to how to evaluate scientific evidence systematically and scientifically, but they're not sufficient. Ultimately, no matter what we do, no matter what we say, no matter how well we can evaluate evidence, ultimately, at some point in the nodal network, in determining who's right and who's wrong, there has to be some trust for what the experts say. Now, you can be a kind of person who evaluates everything the experts say by going and sinking your teeth into the literature yourself. I'm just saying, if you do that, that's a really onerous process. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. And a lot of people mess that up because ultimately they don't have the necessary intellectual tools to do it. And often the people that are guiding them and doing it are misleading them. So it's extraordinarily difficult to do it that way. And I do highly encourage people to ask questions and look deeper into things. But in the end, you have to trust somebody, right? Sometimes people who are even against the experts have their own experts that are telling them, you know, and persuading them about what to think about the evidence. And you have to trust that expert who's telling you those things. Because have you gone into the papers he's gone into? Have you evaluated them the same way that person has evaluated them? Have you dug deep into the scientific literature in the same way that person has and claims to have done? Have you questioned every single presupposition they've had? Have you read those 20 or 30 papers really detailed and careful manner? Because I can tell you that many of those experts who are telling people to challenge the experts, they themselves are getting a lot of things wrong about the science. And sometimes the experts are getting things wrong about the science. And so we ultimately have to trust somebody. We should try as best we can to ask as many questions as we can, but we ultimately need some mechanism, some way of knowing who the best experts are. So what we've gotten from this discussion, in my opinion, is we've gotten that, first off, the evidence hierarchy is not science. It's an introduction to how to think about science in an ideal world, but most scientific evidence isn't ideal. You have to put it together into a complex picture of what the scientific evidence says often, and that requires a great deal of understanding of the detail and how the different pieces of scientific evidence fit together. And that can't be achieved just by using some simple evidence hierarchy. It's much more complicated and much more nuanced and much more intellectual and thoughtful than that. It's just simply impossible. Furthermore, you can't do that with every question yourself because it's so complicated and so difficult. You have to trust other people to some degree. So ultimately, what we've gotten down to in this discussion is that expertise is important, and trust in experts is important, and ultimately trust in experts is the ultimate foundation for public health recommendations and people following public health recommendations. If people don't trust the experts, then everything's lost. Like, it ultimately comes down to trust, and there's no way to bypass that, unfortunately. And so that's my spiel for this morning. I wanted to communicate that to you because I've been thinking a lot about a lot of this stuff lately, and you know, throw it out to the world, and hopefully a few people listen to it and enjoy it. With that, yeah, I hope you liked it. Peace. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please check me out on patreon.com at Kevin and Bass, where you can donate and make this podcast possible. Also check me out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where you can find my latest thoughts on the latest controversies and findings within health science. Also check me out at The Kevin Bass Show, both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I hope this podcast was useful to you. If it was, please leave me a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. See you guys in the next episode.